The gun industry clears up confusion about the ATF zero tolerance policy. Plus, the Fifth Circuit strikes down the federal handgun ban for young adults. All this and more on the news update.
No, the devil's got no hold on me.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the news update. I'm contributing writer Jake Fogleman, joined as always by Stephen Gutowski, founder of thereload.com, which is, of course, where you can head on over today to sign up for our free weekly newsletter. It'll keep you up to date on all things happening in the world of gun politics and policy. This week's episode is also brought to you in part by The Dispatch, but more on that at the end of the show.
Also brought to you from Bohol, Philippines, which is where I currently am. So that's why it's a little bit lower quality. I actually have the same microphone, so hopefully it'll sound pretty good. But at the resort on the beach, pretty nice spot here, visiting my fiance's family. So going well so far, and hopefully this will all upload and work, but we'll see.
Yeah, fingers crossed. Yeah. You've been upgraded to our foreign correspondent for the Reload temporarily. To start off, what we want to talk about this week, it's just an ongoing, what I think is going to be an ongoing theme of our coverage is just the Trump administration's actions on gun policy, or in this case, lack thereof, because we did some reporting about the fact that the ATF's zero tolerance policy, one of the big targets, obviously, of gun rights advocates, is seeing that repealed. And it's still in place. And it's been over 10 days, 11 days now of this administration, and nothing has been done about it. Yeah.
And you're starting to see, as you could tell from your story, which I thought was very thorough, by the way, but that you're actually having gun rights groups come out and start to at least lightly criticize the Trump administration, or, prod them to do more. Obviously, Trump did, we've talked about this a lot. Trump did not make a lot of very specific promises on guns. Trump, as he's wont to do, is very rhetorically pro-gun and has talked about how pro-gun he is. He says that quite a lot, that he's pro-Second Amendment, that, in the way, everybody knows the way he talks. He's saved the Second Amendment, Biden destroyed it, that sort of thing. But as we covered during the campaign, he didn't make a lot of actual policy promises. In fact, he stripped most of them, the specific ones, from the Republican platform. And so, as we're seeing for the first 2 weeks in office now, he's also seems to be deprioritizing the issue further in his nominees, Pam Bondi being an example, RFK Jr. even, who once said the NRA are terrorists. And he hasn't made an ATF pick yet. So, you're still waiting on a lot of things. Now, Trump did make some specific promises early on in 2024 to the NRA. And I was there, covering it live. And one of the things he said is that the first week is when he would undo all of Biden's actions on guns. And we haven't seen any of those undone. And it's been a week. Now, again, as we talked about before, traditionally you're judging a president by the first 100 days, how far along they're getting in their agenda, what they're prioritizing. Now, Trump this time around has clearly tried to make a big splash early, and he's trying to push a lot of things through early. It's a bit chaotic. It's a bit hard to follow on some of this stuff, including like this zero tolerance policy, which we heard. There was a Fox report that it had been rescinded before Trump even took office. And now it seems like from the National Shooting Sports Foundation and also from Gun Owners of America, who is currently suing over this policy, that it's still in place. There hasn't been any practical change. Why don't you tell us a little bit more about exactly why people thought there might have been change and what is really happening?
Right. Yeah. I think it is important to clear, because I saw some social media comments well, it's only been 10 days. Of course, it's still in effect. Sure. Well, the reason this came up is because, like you said, there were stories at outlets like Fox and a few other news sites were saying, the ATS policy has been rescinded. And so I reached out to the National Shooting Sports Foundation. They represent the gun industry. I figured they'd be the ones to know, right, if their dealers were no longer subject to this policy. And it told me that, they've been in contact with the ATF and, zero tolerance is still very much in effect. And the whole confusion was there was a separate lawsuit against the zero tolerance policy filed by Michael Cargill. He's known as the named plaintiff in the case that ultimately struck down the bump stock ban. He's also a gun store owner, and so he was suing. And in the course of that litigation, ATF produced a document, an internal document from last August that sort of, in a way, seemed to soften zero tolerance a little bit. Basically, it's basically enforcement guidelines to field agents saying, even if they should have known these paperwork violations, it's their responsibility to get them correct. Making an error may not necessarily be evidence of a willful violation of the law. And so sort of like it'll be fact dependent, use your best judgment sort of a thing.
Right. Because that's been the big complaint, right? Is that there's been a lot more revocations of gun dealer licenses in the Biden administration. Like that's plainly true. We know that.
Yeah.
And that's been one of their goals, and not necessarily to revoke licenses, but to more strictly enforce the regulations on gun dealers, which will lead inevitably to more gun license revocations. And so the complaint has been from the industry that these are happening oftentimes over minor violations, paperwork violations. They say nothing, whereas nobody bought a gun or was able to get a gun that wasn't legally allowed to, and no real harm came from the violation. That's been the fight. The gun control groups obviously want stricter enforcement, and Biden has had, catered more towards their wishes, and the industry has said, you're going too far with some of these things. And so that's what the dispute is. And then, you have this Cargill lawsuit, and there was, the memo that came out of it, but I guess that didn't actually necessarily change things practically on the ground.
And actually looked in the memo, and the zero tolerance language is still in that memo as well, which is one hint that it's on the books. And then, the NSSF said that they haven't heard anything from their dealers that the ATF has had a change in action when they actually do these inspections. It's pretty much business as usual, is my understanding. And I actually looked at some of the revocation data that came out in the subsequent months after this memo was circulated. And it's, dipped slightly, but I don't know if it's enough to say that it was a cause and effect type of thing. It's within the realm of the same trend of revocations, even before the memo. So evidence points to the fact that it's still pretty much having the same effect.
Yeah. And so now you're starting to see, in response to that, some criticism of the Trump administration, or at least some prodding to do more, right? NSSF was saying this before Trump was inaugurated, that they wanted him to go and start doing this, undoing, this rule. And then, obviously a lot of gun rights advocates want him to undo all of the Biden rules, which is basically what he said he would do. Of the promises, specific gun policy promises he made, that's basically the extent of it. He has said he would sign something like a national reciprocity bill, though that, we interviewed Rep. Hudson, who's the sponsor for that, a couple of weeks ago. But I would still say, and he seems optimistic that maybe that could get through with Biden, with Trump's help, if he put a lot of pressure on Congress. But one, there's no sign he's going to do that. And two, even if he did, I still think it's a long shot to get national reciprocity through the Senate. I mean, you're going to need Democrats to come around on the issue. We haven't seen any sign of that happening yet. But either way, one thing Donald Trump can certainly do without, needing legislation is start the process of undoing these rules. And he hasn't done any of that as far as we can tell. The ATF, in fact, seems to be back to its 2021 state, because Marvin Richardson is the current head of the ATF. As far as we can tell, the ATF won't say anything about anything, to us at least. So we're flying in it's a little bit of a dark information blackout on that front. We did see Trump, I guess, deputize ATF agents to make immigration arrests. It's not, I don't know if it's clear what that's going to result in practically, but that's kind of the one thing he's done with the ATF, is give them more authority in a different area. But right now, ATF agents have more authority than they did before he took office, and we haven't seen any changes to these policies yet. And it seems like some gun rights groups at least are starting to get a bit antsy on that front.
Yeah, I think that to me is the takeaway that like GOA, as we mentioned sort of at the top of this segment, actually specifically mentioned that week one promise in they sent an email blast out to their members and urged them to start a letter campaign and send them to the Trump administration to get them off the sidelines, essentially. And it specifically references he promised week one, and it's been a week and everything is still in place. So it is interesting to see that be specifically cited by a gun rights group.
That is literally what he said the first week. Now, as we've talked about before as well, one of his things he said he would do is fire the previous ATF director, but he couldn't do that because he resigned ahead of Trump taking office, Stephen Dettelbach. So, there's a little bit of like some of these things got accomplished on their own, I guess, or at least one thing. Yeah, I mean, we haven't heard anything from the NRA yet. They're still sort of cleaning up the end of their corruption trial, that whole ordeal. They're still coming out of that. And a lot of the people who were there that had strong connections to Trump world, I guess, are not really there anymore, right? So Chris Cox, the former head of the Institute for Legislative Action, their top lobbyists, had and still has, as far as I'm aware, a close relationship with Trump Jr. at least, and directly with Trump himself when he was president. So they don't have somebody like that right now necessarily. At least we haven't seen, public evidence that they're having meetings at the White House or anything like the NRA did the first time around. So they may be working the behind the scenes and soft power. I don't have any reporting on that. I haven't heard anything like that. But the NRA has been pretty quiet publicly. GOA, NSSF, National Association for Gun Rights have been more vocal in their concerns that the things they want aren't getting done. Now, again, it's Donald Trump. We all know how Donald Trump talks. So he said a week, and my preference is to hold politicians to things they say. But, Trump tends to exaggerate all the time. So his supporters may not hold him to the same standard that I would, but and again, he has a lot of time to do these things, and that may be enough for gun rights advocates in the end. Is if he actually follows through eventually, the fact that it didn't happen the very first week may not be a huge concern to them. Also, I feel like the other thing that this brings up is like, well, all right, let's say gun rights advocates start to turn on Trump and if they become unhappy with him not following through on some of these things, or not getting the stuff that they actually want out of another administration where Trump is president and Republicans have control of Congress, because they didn't get a lot, and especially in terms of legislation last time around. Certainly, the question then is like, how much pressure can they really put on it? How much political capital they have to use against Trump? How much is he going to care? And that's where it's less clear. This is something Kevin Williamson discussed last week on the show, and that we've talked about before. You would think that with Republicans in control of Congress and the White House, that gun rights advocates who are part of their coalition would have a significant amount of pull on what gets done. But, I don't know that that's totally true at this point. We haven't seen a lot of evidence of that. Trump himself has never had to pay any real political cost for the way that he, went against gun rights advocates in the first administration on occasion, right? Certainly the bump stock ban being the obvious example of that. But even, we talked a lot about Pam Bondi and some of her comments that she made that has upset gun rights activists as well, talking about supporting red flag laws or age restrictions for gun purchases, which we have another story on that coming up in a minute here. But, as we've mentioned, that those comments were made in front of Trump at his invitation and with his support, and he's made similar comments. And it didn't cost him really, certainly not in the Republican primary. You didn't see Trump pay any sort of political price for that. Now I would say that his opponents didn't really try very hard to make him pay a price for that. It seems like they determined it wasn't going to be an effective way of campaigning against him, but they really didn't use it at all. I think there's one ad very early on from the DeSantis side, even though he had seemed to set himself up to try and run to the right of Trump on guns. He just didn't really do it when it came down to it. And Trump didn't suffer because of that. And so, how much Trump feels indebted to the NRA or gun rights movement this time around, I think is an open question. He canceled a rally with the NRA at the very end. He did do two, right? He spoke to them in February where he made the promise about doing all this stuff in the first week. And then he spoke to them again at their annual meeting. I think it was in May. So he was supposed to have a third rally in October, but that got canceled at the last minute without explanation for why exactly, although it did happen right after the animal cruelty story came out with the new NRA head. So probably had something to do with that, but we don't know for sure. Either way, he just hasn't, outside of strong rhetorical support for the Second Amendment, and then what he, in sort of the generic way of saying he's a defender of the Second Amendment, he hasn't really gone out of his way to do a lot to try and win over gun voters. It feels like he maybe assumes they're just with him. They're kind of taken for granted a bit, it seems. And, to be fair, like, where are they going to go? Right. I mean, I think that was one of the dynamics from the last election. Like, the Democrats are not really making a play for gun voters at all. And haven't seemed to do that in the wake of Trump's victory either. Harris had this stuff where she's trying to make herself a little more relatable, talking about how she owned a gun. But, obviously her background was in trying to ban pretty much all guns, right? She supported a handgun ban and confiscation scheme in San Francisco when she was DA. And then later on, she supported a assault weapons ban and confiscation scheme when she was running for president the first time around. So, the most gun rights advocates can do, other than putting public pressure, like GOA is suggesting, writing to the president or writing to their senators. You could try to pressure them into blocking certain nominees. That hasn't seemed to go very far at this point. Pam Bondi is going to cruise through. RFK may have problems, but it probably won't be because of his record on gun policy. It'll be the anti-vaxxer stuff and whatever else, if he doesn't make it through. And, we had the DEA pick that got sunk early on, and gun policy played a little bit of a role in that, but it's probably also still more COVID related. That was what seemed to be a lot of the backlash to him. So, there's that. And then really just kind of sitting out elections is the main thing that gun rights advocates have as far as power over the Republican Party at this point. If things get bad enough and there's enough of a backlash, if that were to happen, and this is all pretty speculative down the line stuff, but since we're seeing some pushback from gun rights advocates against Trump right now, it's worth thinking through this stuff. Like, what power do they really have at this point? And inside of that coalition. And I think the priority, where they fall on the priority list, reflects that they don't have a lot at this moment. If you anger enough gun voters and they sit out, then Republicans have it, may regret that in the midterms, but that's probably where you'd actually see that. And that would be the thing that Republicans and Trump would perhaps want to worry about. But it's not clear that they are thinking much about this at all.
Yeah, I think that's right. Of course, we'll stay on top of it, obviously, as the Trump administration continues. And there seems to be a flurry of new executive orders every single day. So maybe one of them will be a gun one eventually. And we'll be able to
we don't. It's probably noticed we're trying to be pretty careful about making any sort of broad sweeping declarations on what Trump is and isn't going to do on gun policy, because because he didn't do it in the time frame he said he would do it doesn't mean he won't eventually do these things, and doesn't mean he won't make gun rights advocates happy. Obviously, most of them, and there's another sort of interesting dynamic here too. which may segue a bit into what we're going to talk about next. But the big trump card for Donald Trump on gun policy has always been that he appointed 3 Supreme Court justices who were in the majority in Bruin. And, that's an easy thing that if you're a Trump supporter and you're trying to, or the Trump administration, and you're trying to lay out, why gun voters should support the guy. If you're just focused on this particular issue, that's what you would point to a lot of the time. He appointed 3 judges in the majority in Bruin, which was the big Second Amendment case that the Supreme Court decided in 2022, right? It created a new standard for judging gun laws, whether they comport with the Second Amendment. That may also start to, the luster on that might start to fade here soon, because one of the problems you've seen is while Bruin happened, right, the court has, and that is, concealed carry for people who live in deeper blue areas, sort of the main effect of that, although even that has been pretty curtailed at this point because of the Bruin response laws that a lot of these places have passed, which make it very difficult to carry in practice in most areas, even if you get a permit. So, the actual practical effect of Bruin is fairly limited right now as far as the specific case itself. One of the things we're going to talk about is some of the fallout in the lower courts from it. That's more substantial. But, if the court doesn't take up some of these high profile cases that gun rights advocates have wanted them to do for decades now, especially since Heller, at least. And that would be at the top of most people's list in the gun rights movement is an assault weapons ban. They want the court to strike down bans on popular rifles like the AR-15, right? Because they have argued forever that it's incompatible with even just Heller, because Heller's standard was common use. You can't ban guns that are in common use. And the argument goes that the most popular rifle, and we saw Justice Thomas talking about this, obviously, very recently when the court decided not to take up an assault weapons ban case, the most popular rifle in America, the argument goes from the gun rights advocates, must be in common use, right? For lawful purposes. So, we're waiting right now, and I think they're already past the point. We've talked about this a lot, right? They really tried to wait for a Goldilocks case. They don't want to take something on an interlocutory basis, too premature, not having all the facts fully developed in the case. And so now they finally have a case like that, Snope, out of the Fourth Circuit, Maryland's assault weapons ban, and they've just been sitting on it. They've been relisting it over and over again. And it seems like, at least from, we've seen Mark Smith, Costas Morris, some of these gun rights lawyers discuss this, and they think that it's past the point now where they would be able to hear this in this term. So we may not have an answer on this for a while. Now, the Supreme Court can kind of do whatever it wants to a certain degree. So just because it appears to be past the deadline for when they would hear it, that may not be the case, just because the court can kind of do whatever, set its own schedule. It's just going off of how they've typically operated. We're pushed past even the point of them taking it and answering, the biggest question in Second Amendment advocacy, and at least legal advocacy right now. And if they don't do that, or, and this is possible, if they let the lower court decision stand, which upheld the ban, or they themselves come out with a ruling that says it's okay to ban AR-15s under the Second Amendment, that's going to really take a lot of the shine off of Trump's biggest accomplishment on gun rights. And so, pointing to, most practical thing he can do as president is roll back some of these rules, which will be, even that is sort of a temporary thing, because the next president can come in and undo that themselves. That's the nature of executive orders. But the judicial appointments have always been the thing that gun rights advocates, I think, have hung their hat on as far as Trump's bona fides go. And if his court, if the justices he put on that court don't follow through on delivering the sort of rulings that gun rights advocates have hoped for a long time, then it starts to be a more open question of how the movement reacts to him.
Yeah, I think that's right. Speaking of the courts, though, we have another story about a big ruling today, sort of the fallout from that Bruin decision. This one out of the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, where a 3-judge panel just unanimously voted to strike down the federal law that bans licensed firearm dealers from selling handguns to those that are under the age of 21. This is the first time that a federal appeals court has done this since Bruin was handed down in 2022. So it's a pretty big deal ruling.
Yeah, and that is one of those lower court effects of Bruin. The Supreme Court has only done one case on the Second Amendment since they decided Bruin, but the lower courts have been much more active, and especially places like the Fifth Circuit have been much more aggressive in enforcing that new standard. And this is a perfect example of that, where they concluded that, the plain text of the Second Amendment, the right to keep and bear arms, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. That applies to 18 to 20-year-olds and their ability to purchase handguns. And then the historical analogs they found not only did not support the modern restriction, but actually the opposite, right? That was their conclusion.
Yeah, it was interesting. They pretty much right off the bat, even before getting into the full historical analysis, were like, hey, government, you're in a tough spot because we have this thing called the Militia Act of 1792 that required all, adults 18 and older to muster for the militia and provide their own firearms for that. So we have this clear evidence that pretty much right at the ratification of the Second Amendment that there were 18-year-olds with firearms. So you're going to have to come up with some pretty good evidence that there was historical tradition of not allowing those same people to have guns. And surprise, surprise, that panel that made that claim also ended up coming down and saying, no, your analogs don't pass muster, because the ones that the government did offer all came from between like the 1850s to the 1880s. And there were state laws that, to be fair, were pretty close matches. They restricted, gun ownership to folks under the age of 21. But they said that that's far too late when we have this actual founding era evidence that they did have guns. So
right,
that was the end of it for that panel.
Yeah. So they, and that's been remanded. They remanded that case back down to the lower court, and we'll see, a decision that will presumably enjoin this law, unless we get an appeal. That'll be another interesting thing to watch for the Trump administration too. How do they handle these kind of cases? Yeah.
This will be a test of Trump's gun policy mettle, because I think there's going to be a contingent of gun rights advocates that'll say, hey, Trump DOJ, don't appeal it. Just let it stand. And and so we'll have to see if that's something he's willing to do. And
that's another thing where Pam Bondi is going to be important. Like, if Trump isn't paying close attention to this stuff, and he usually isn't, frankly, guns is not a top priority. Not something he talked a ton about in his first administration, outside of mass shooting events. So, presumably a lot of that gets delegated to the Attorney General and her team. And that's another area where, that was one of the big criticisms of her from the gun rights advocates, is that when she was Florida AG, she chose to vigorously defend a lot of these gun control laws, even before the Parkland ones that were passed. There was conflicts between her and the NRA and other gun rights groups on how she handled some of the court cases surrounding Florida's gun laws. And so, we'll see how that'll be a good indicator of, what is Pam Bondi going to be like as Attorney General? Is she going to vigorously defend these federal gun laws? Is she going to take a less aggressive approach in that regard? We'll see. Obviously the Attorney General's job is to defend the laws, but there is leeway in how you go about doing it. And certainly you've seen that from all administrations, really, but so that'll be a good one to watch. And, and also it seems like we may get a circuit split on this in the near future, right?
Yeah, it was a funny coincidence that literally 1 hour before this Fifth Circuit decision was handed down, the Fourth Circuit was hearing oral arguments over the same exact question. So there's a lawsuit currently. We'll be awaiting a decision. It's, no telling when that decision will actually be handed down, but just based on the panel draw, it's another 3-judge panel. And two of the judges on that panel were judges that upheld Maryland's assault weapon ban in the Snope case. So I think it's probably a safe bet that these folks are going to uphold the federal law restricting young adult handgun sales, in which case you would have a circuit split, presuming, of course, that the Trump administration doesn't appeal and have some overturning of that
right
lower decision.
So we'll keep an eye on that one for sure. But yeah, big ruling. Absolutely.
Yeah. And speaking of rulings out of the circuit courts, this one comes to us from the Sixth Circuit, dealing with sort of the ongoing legal controversy surrounding, prominent American gun maker Sig Sauer, and in particular their P320 pistol, which is probably their most common pistol. It's certainly their flagship pistol, and folks claiming that it's prone to accidental discharges without intentional manipulation of the trigger. Some of these claims tend to be more dubious than others.
Right.
In this case, this particular lawsuit, it was enough to convince a 3-judge panel of the Sixth Circuit to revive a previously dismissed claim against a man who said that it fired while it was in his holster, although again, there's some open questions as to whether it was actually in his holster or he was putting it in his holster. But I guess it was enough for this panel to say that, hey, this can go to trial.
Yeah, I guess there was a dispute over the expert testimony and whether or not these experts could actually speak to whether this gun could have fired on its own or, in the specific circumstance. But yeah, like you said, these suits against Sig Sauer over the P320, which is a very popular handgun. In fact, I own a 320 X5, and it's one of the most common handguns in America now. A lot of police, a lot of law enforcement use them as their sidearm, and there's been an ongoing controversy over the safety of this particular design because of the way that there's no external safety in the sense that there's no like mechanical safety that you actuate as the user of the Sig P320, although you can order them with external safeties. I'm pretty sure. You can get a thumb safety or whatever for it if you wanted to. But that's not uncommon, right? The vast majority of modern handguns don't feature mechanical external safeties, especially carry guns. Most people don't want them who carry because, it's another thing you have to train into doing before the gun will actually operate. And so people don't like that in a life and death situation. It depends on the person, but the vast majority, I think, of concealed carriers no longer use guns with mechanical external safeties. Some do, certainly, but not. If you're going out in the market and you're looking at what's out there, the P320 design is not, the basic concept is not unusual. Glock has been doing it forever. The difference is the internal safeties. There's internal mechanical safeties on all these modern handguns like the Glocks. And SIG's is a specific design, a proprietary design for how there's internal safeties work, whether it's the like striker block or the internal mechanisms that make it so the gun won't fire unless the trigger is pulled. And there's been criticism over that design and whether it's robust enough or not. And so you've seen a lot of these lawsuits. And like you said, some of them are more credible than others. This one feels on the less credible side, just by the police report that you mentioned in the story. I guess he at one point told police that the gun fired while he was reholstering the gun. And that sounds like a scenario where it's more likely that something got caught in the trigger well and pulled the trigger than it is that the gun just went off on its own. There have been other scenarios, though, where there's video, I believe, of one incident where you can see that the gun is holstered and not being manipulated. Or there's another one where the gun is in a holster in a bag, and the person is walking with the bag, and the bag is bouncing against them, and then the gun goes off. And so, it's not entirely clear what's going on in some of these situations. And certainly the P320 had an issue early on that was repeatable and demonstrable. And there were a lot of YouTube videos actually showing that the drop safety, because the trigger was too heavy. And if you dropped it at just the right angle, the trigger could pull itself just by its own weight sort of reciprocating. And so, the 320 has been something that SIG has had to fight in court over a lot. And it's an interesting thing to follow because, like, as we're talking about here, some of these claims feel much more dubious than other ones. Like this one feels fairly dubious. And the dissent in this case actually clearly from somebody who knows firearms pretty well. And I think
Judge Amul Thapar, for anyone listening, he's a pretty prominent conservative justice and rumored to be on Trump's shortlist for the Supreme Court multiple times. So he's a prominent guy. And like you said, he kind of goes through, he actually does like a whole paragraph explaining to folks kind of what you mentioned, where to people who don't know guns, they might think it's weird that this gun doesn't have a safety. But in fact, this is actually standard practice for most people that carry guns for self-defense. And he also talks about, just like as you said, they make P320s with a safety if you want one. And this particular plaintiff obviously chose voluntarily to get one without one. How should that be SIG's fault for, making a defective pistol or whatever? And that was the point he made. But he was overruled, obviously, by two fellow judges.
Yeah. So, when I was reading his explanation, he clearly is somebody who knows firearms and understands them on at least a hobbyist level. Right. And so that's pretty rare to see in a judge, to be frank. Like judges usually their job is either side will bring in their arguments and bring in their experts, and the judge is supposed to read that stuff and get educated from that and make a decision, based on, becoming educated by the parties involved. This judge clearly had a little more going on. He obviously must actually shoot because a lot of that's one of my things. It's the same thing for media coverage. Guns just going off is so uncommon with modern firearms. Like there may be an issue with the 320's design. Right. I don't want to get ahead of like saying there is or isn't. Like I said, some of these cases sound much more troubling than others, but this is not a new claim. Right? You've had a lot of lawsuits like this in the past where they just or news stories where the claim is that the gun just went off on its own, and then you hear the actual description of what happened, and it's like, oh no, that's a negligent discharge. That's you doing something that you shouldn't have been doing, and then the trigger got pulled and went off because the trigger was pulled. That if the trigger is pulled, that's not a defect in the gun design.
Right.
That's
how guns work.
Yeah, that's how it's designed to work. If the trigger doesn't get pulled and the gun goes off, then you've got a problem. And there have been, instances of poor design where there's some flaw that causes that to happen. And this is another thing too, just very briefly about liability, right? This is a suit that can happen because Sig Sauer and the rest of the gun industry is not exempted from these kind of lawsuits. This was something former President Biden at this point, had constantly lied about. Because there is a liability shield for the gun industry, right? The Protection of Lawful Commerce and Arms Act. We talk about it a lot. It deals with like this Mexico case at the Supreme Court against American manufacturers. It deals with the idea that American gun manufacturers can't be liable for the criminal acts of third parties they weren't involved with. So it doesn't have anything to do with, it doesn't mean that there's a full shield from any sort of lawsuit against the gun industry. You can, and people do sue gun companies for faulty product design. That's common. And it's happened with even some of the biggest, most popular brands and guns, the Remington 700 bolt action fire, like one of the most famous and popular bolt action guns, had an issue where they faced suits. I just want to mention that because it gets something that people get confused about. You can sue gun makers just like you can sue a car maker or whatever. It's not a full liability shield. And this is an example of that.
No, it's good. It's good to bring that up because, like you said, like one of our raison d'etres here at the Reload is to correct what we see faulty claims that are commonly bandied about firearms. And, we like to point out it's actually not true. And here's evidence. One of the last stories we published from the Reload this week is actually something we republished, but Kevin D. Williamson, I think you teased in the interview podcast you did with him last week, this would be coming, and now it's officially out for folks to check out on thereload.com. But his series, we condensed it into an analysis piece, just talking about the ATF and some of why it's become a political hot button issue and some of the things that the ATF does and its regulatory power. So listeners and readers should definitely go check that out.
Yeah, and check out the podcast with him if you haven't already. But it's a great series, I think, that delves into the big picture with the ATF. Like, what is it? What does it actually do in practice? How does it operate? What are some of the problems with that model? What are some of the ways that some of the alternatives that could be implemented instead, or what you could do with the ATF? Because Kevin is not, as you saw on the podcast, he's not somebody who necessarily wants to eliminate the ATF or eliminate all gun laws. Certainly, there are people like that, but he takes a much more detailed approach to his analysis of the agency and its issues and potential solutions. So I think it's a really good piece. I think it's worth reading all the way through. He has some good reporting in there too, where he interviews gun dealers and he talks to the NSSF as well. And the ATF wasn't talking to him either. So I don't know, the ATF has been a bit of a black box the last couple of weeks here. So we'll see if they start talking again soon. Could just be this kind of transition has been a little chaotic in addition to how much they've been trying to do. And that's, look, we'll see if it gets cleared up hopefully sooner rather than later, but we'll be on top of all that for sure. And, I think speaking of the Dispatch, we actually have an ad from them to finish off the show. But before we get to that, I have some really good news. If, like me, you want to see the Eagles beat the Chiefs in the Super Bowl next week, which I'm sure everybody, right? You all have to root for the Eagles now, unless you
by default. By default, I'm rooting for the Eagles. Yeah.
Unless you're a Chiefs fan. I mean, your guys are stuck with us now. Like, you have to, there's no way you can be rooting for the Chiefs unless if you're a Chiefs fan, okay, sure. But everyone else, come on, let's be serious. Anyway, Brandon Graham, one of my favorite players, defensive end for the Eagles, tore his tricep. It's probably his last year playing. He's 65 years old in football years. They're like dog years, right? Like, he's younger than me, but in football years, he's old. He tore his tricep in week 12 and he's practicing now. He's probably, I would imagine he will be playing in the Super Bowl. He's the one, for anybody who remembers, that stripped Tom Brady in the Super Bowl to win the game for the Eagles. So I would really like to see him on the field. I'm looking forward to that. Once I get back from the Philippines, it's a 12-hour difference, by the way, or 11-hour, I guess now, between Philippines and DC. So it's been, we'll see. I actually use this app called Time Shifter. It's not an ad. Although if they want to sponsor us, feel free to reach out. But it helps you with jet lag, and it actually has worked great. So if you're ever going on a trip where you're completely inverting your time, like me, I'd recommend it. But that's all we've got for this week, and I'm going to hand it over to myself to talk a little bit about the Dispatch for you. All right, folks, it's time to talk a little bit about the Dispatch, doing an ad swap here between the Reload and the Dispatch. And I think that's fitting because if you like what you're getting from the Reload in terms of high quality reporting that focuses on hard news, you'll probably like the Dispatch as well, because get this, they also focus on high quality reporting and hard news. Now, they are a much broader publication than the Reload. We obviously focus on one specific area, whereas the Dispatch has a much larger team and is able to focus on a whole number of other issues, but still primarily in that national politics realm like we do here at the Reload. But they are one of my favorite publications. I am a paying member to the Dispatch, and so clearly, I highly recommend it. I've been a paying member since they were founded, and I've never had reason to rethink that even once. So they are constantly breaking news stories. They are sending you newsletters on whatever frequency you want. They have quite a variety of them over there. But I subscribe, for instance, to the Morning Dispatch, and I get, I think, a very nice summary of what's really going on from a pretty sober perspective. That newsletter is hard news, and it's focused on it. And I think it's fantastic. But they also, of course, have some of the best commentators, in my personal opinion, over there as well. You know, it was an outlet founded by Steve Hayes and Jonah Goldberg, two guys I've known for a long time. They've been on the Reloads podcast. Kevin Williamson as well has been on our podcast. So you've heard from these guys if you've been a Reload listener for a while here. And, you know, I think you should check out the Dispatch if you haven't already. We have a free trial as well, 30-day free trial for Reload listeners if you want to go over and check out their paid offering, which I think is well worth the money. So I'd encourage you to do that. There's a link in the description of this podcast or on our website if you want to check it out. So head over to the Reload or to get that link, or head over to the Dispatch to see what they're all about.